Hej och hjärtligt välkomna till H606. And today we'll take it in English, and it's this marvelous, fantastically interesting article by Richard E. Lind. A paper written when he was at Springfield in Missouri, and it's called The Historical Origins of the Modern Mind-Body Split. And it's just up our alley, this article, because it treats the historical and most interesting development through Greece and onwards. And where he starts off is the constant argument that the relocation of subjectivity began several thousand years ago. Or this started out as a subjective experience in the centric region of the heart, and in the body as a whole began to be favored of the eccentric head as a new location of subjectivity. So this is this change of subjectivity. And to give some flesh to this explanation, I can show that normally in East Asian countries they sign to themselves by using the nose, but when it comes to thinking, it's in the heart. Whereas in the West, the eye can be the whole body, you can point towards the chest, but when it comes to thinking, it's always the heart. Look at this one. This means you're crazy. This means that you're thinking, or that you're smart. And this means always emotional, something lesser than being rational, something a bit I have to accommodate, sorry that. Something a bit less specific, not the seat of rationality, which usually is the head. And it is no wonder that our investigations into rationality usually takes its lead into the head. We see the brain as representation, we see the eyes as cameras observing the world around us, taking in, perceiving. Everything is to do with the head, and it's also in the head where this famous or infamous homunculus is situated. But this is not how it used to be at all, and is still not in the case in most cultures in the world. Head centricity is a typical trait of Western society, nothing else. And we have currently two theories, hypotheses to keep in mind when it comes to this thinking of the switch from the body as being center of consciousness and subjectivity rather. And the first one is that somewhere in prehistorical time, all individual experience was an integrated subjectivity in the heart and the body as a whole. But you had a gradual development, and little by little we lost touch with this form of awareness of subjectivity, and it moved into the head. And the other one, which is the most common formally, is that the head and the heart was always separated, and the integration of the head and the heart, mind and body, was only attained by those who experienced a type of religious conversion or became successfully engaged in a certain type of religious discipline. For instance, initiation, rites, personal and or collective religious quests. And both hypotheses, they suggest that the majority of the current population have today a subjectivity that is head consciousness, and they are therefore estranged from a more unified field of consciousness that included their bodies. Or regarding this former theory, it's further suggested that the psychology of this majority of individuals who presumably suffer from internal conflict associated with, if not caused by, a split between mind and body, was shaped by often misdirected and unsuccessful efforts to relieve this suffering through belief in and dedication to various religious systems and disciplines. And I'd said both these categories, aspects, they have strange strains of being real. They do ring a bell. And what do we find in the annals of history? When you compare, for instance, the primarily religious literature describing psychological experience of ancient Egyptian, Greek, Jewish individuals prior to about 500 before Christ, and with literature describing modern individuals since about the year 700. You could say that the Homeric Greek heroes, as portrayed by Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey, were described as experiencing the location of all psychological processes in a specific area of the body, as opposed to the head, which came later. The Homeric hero, he feels and thinks with the phrenes or midriff here, whence the latter phronesis was thought or wisdom. More often the location of thought and feeling was referred to the heart. It is argued below that the subjectivity of heart and body found in ancient literature has no equivalent in modern psychological literature. And this consciousness of the heart is vaguely and only rarely referred to in contemporary descriptions as a religious experience. And this provides important clues to what is the historical origins of what have since been referred to as the psychological split between mind and body in modern individuals. And we find so many references in the ancient literature supporting the existence of a unified consciousness of mind and body, so-called heart consciousness. And this cannot be described as compelling and often appear from a modern perspective to be more of a metaphoric than a literal reference to the heart in some of the literature from several early Western cultures like Egyptian, Hebraic or Greek in the period roughly before 500 BCE. And this implies a subjectivity that is significantly different from psychological descriptions of modern individuals. The relative infrequency of the reference to a heart consciousness, especially of reference that in modern terms would be characterized as secular, might be due to this form of subjectivity being taken for granted, just as modern literature does not often refer specifically to the head as the center of subjectivity. And I think this is very important. When we look through ancient literature and reference, we cannot expect there to be too many references, because if you take something for granted, you don't specifically mention it. It's, so to speak, assumed beforehand, nothing you need to make a special assumption about, because it's inferred. We could say standing, but you can also say standing on the ground, but the ground is always there. There is no actual need to pinpoint or describe the ground specifically, because it's always been there, it will always be there. And I think this is very interesting, and something you should hold in view when you regard ancient literature. And I think it's often misregarded, because we see the ancient literature as bona fide for everything, but it's not, because we don't know which things were taken for granted in those times and things that were subsumed. And using our new language here, our new tunes, which was implicit, is most often not explicitly mentioned. So it wouldn't be a reason to say every time that Homer mentions that Patroclus to be thinking with his heart, he just say thinking, but thereby meaning he's thinking with the heart and nothing else. And what we can say that the psychology of ancient individuals before 500 BCE can only be indirectly and incompletely surmised from available literature for several reasons. Insufficient descriptions of psychological experience, which is very uncommon to mention specifically what did that person feel, is usually descriptions of the person doing something. And also the language usage, and also what we will say culture differences that are no longer understood, and the consequent impossibility of accurate translations. And I think this goes to show the incredible importance of taking these things in regard and being very, very careful from what conclusions we draw from the past. I actually have a friend of mine, she's looking into musical text, lyrics, and also literature from the 16th century, 16th century, the 17th century in Sweden. And from that she draws very, very broad and specific, also specific conclusions about how misogynic was the society in those times. And she found a plethora of misogynic expressions, and from that she drew the conclusion that they were highly misogynic in those times. We cannot draw those conclusions at all. This is completely ludicrous, I would say, because we had no idea of the implicit meaning those days. What we do when we read these things is that we implicitly take from our modern experience without knowing it, and we infer the meaning to the old expressions. And some of the texts I read are just would be ludicrous, that would be that misogynic, because we had loads of expressions even in modern talking that are negative but are never used like that. You can even say in Swedish, this food tastes is good as shit, and somebody else will perceive that as incredibly negative because the implicit meaning is completely different. Most English speaking would consider that to be almost abusively negative, as pejorative as it comes, when it actually is a rather crude compliment. But it's so common, even my own parents use that, and then never cursed or anything like that. And that goes to say that it's ludicrous not to take the implicit meaning. Just you go completely in the wrong way. It's shocking when people do those conclusions. I've done it myself, so well. Kasta inte sten I glashus. Don't throw rocks within the glass house, or whatever it's called in English. But anyway, I think I made a point. But we have, let's start with a quote. We have this one from Archilochus, 680 to 640 before Christ, who was a Greek mercenary soldier, and this has both metaphoric and literal implications that distinguish it from modern psychological discourse. And it goes as following: Heart, my heart, so battered with misfortune, far beyond your strength up, and face the men who hate us. Bare your chest to the assault of the enemy, and fight them off. Keep some measure in the joy you take in luck, and the degree you give way to sorrow. All our life is up and down like this. And here you see clearly it's a shared identity as well as an affiliation and discourse that gives the heart provenance in regard to certain qualities, such as courage and emotion. The metaphorical usage is unusual but comprehensible in this translation. In what follows, however, instead of assuming that this language is a form of poetic license, it will be in Swedish, well, you can say in English, exception, the literal implication of this discourse are explored. That the heart or the chest region, but not necessarily the actual organ of the heart, was experienced by some exceptional, if not all, ancient individuals, a kind of co-equal identity, and especially as an organ of perception facilitative of religious experience. And I think that goes to show that sometimes it is mentioned, and those cases are so unusual. When you compare that to modern usage, you see a clear difference. And these quotes, these inclusions are very good to be used as some sort of evidence, something different going on, also implicitly. And in contrast to a hypothesized integrated heart consciousness that will be described below, the literature describing modern individuals exclusively locates psychological processes in a transcendent, non-physical mind located in the head. And I think that goes to show the importance. This is also transpersonal, transcendent. We don't actually mean literally situated in the head until recently, I think. But it's a sort of transcendence. Mind is not of this world. And this goes to show the distance that has been created, if we should follow the first of the mentioned theories, or has always been there. But the important thing is that it's also very transcendent. It's not a location only, it's also the transcendence. The distance is far, far away. Mind is nothing in or of this world. It's estranged from this world, so to speak. And this subjectivity of the head tends to objectify experience, and that's also important, because we need a transcendence to have an objectified experience. That is actually when to think about it, what we mean by an objectified experience. We assume or think that subjectivity, mind or ourselves is something transcendent, and therefore we can also say that experience is objective. We need the both. We need a transcendence to say that experience is objective. Now, I think that's extremely interesting. Very good conclusion of Lind. And you can thereby have judgmentally distance. You can judgmentally distance itself from all the ingredients of consciousness, because it doesn't have to be in the body anymore. And you can take away all bodily sensations, inclinations, most often emotions, and everything that is not qualified or does not qualify as self-generated thoughts, i.e. the mind. While self-generated thought is owned, most of the rest of experience, and particularly that experience via the body, is disowned. Also extremely interesting, wouldn't you say? And this disowned part is more or less objectified as strictly other, something else, not the same, other. So this head consciousness tends towards the assumption of controlling the experience and favors disintegration and individuation, setting up artificial distinctions and barriers between itself and the rest. the objectified and rejected portions of the psyche, the body, others, and experience of the world in itself. This is so clear, I never heard it formulated in this clear way any time before, but it's exactly what happens. For me to say that my experience is objective, I have to say that my subjectivity is transcendent. It's not really part of my body, it's not in my head. Even though we these days, because of neurology and brain research, think somehow consciousness come from the head, it's not really in language, in thinking, situated there. It's still something other in the head, and this otherness gives a possibility to make the world other. You need two others, and therefore the body. So I can have here, when I look around, an experience of objectively seeing the world around me, whereas I can say that my feelings, my sensory perception, that it's cold here, it's half dark, and I feel tired, those things have nothing to do with my objective experience. Can you see now how eloquently and clear he puts everything? You can see the division being there. You can always sense it. And I think very few people today would not agree on this in some way, that our experience is somehow very, very objective. It's not, it's something we share with others for some reason we don't know, but it's objective. And we draw conclusions from this. And anybody I ask, I would say, would we see the same street view around us here? Everything is the same. And then we say we have an objective experience. You would never ever say that in, for instance, Japanese. Would never happen. You can't say that. It wouldn't make sense. But we trick ourselves. When we start talking to other people, we reinforce this idea of an objective experience. But it's completely and utterly dependent on this criteria that Lin just mentioned here. The ridiculous idea, I would say, that consciousness is transcendent, is not of the head, is not of this world, is vaguely situated in the head. But by pointing to the head, we are pointing to the eyes, we pointing to the visual experience, and an experience that's not part of the world anymore, the video camera. And in psychological descriptions of the modern Western individual, the body is relatively mute, not part. It's described as the location of drives, instincts, desires, as well as physical pleasures, the aches and pains. Modern North American individuals, for example, are more concerned with the appearance and the utility of the body than with its experience, and tend to objectify the body in regard to its attractiveness and its capabilities. The body is included in self-awareness, but individuals rarely attribute subjective experience to bodily locations, despite the still common use of metaphors that imply the inclusions of the heart and other parts of the body in psychological experience. In the modern era, although emotions and sensations are still experienced in the body, this shared sense of awareness is notably limited by the sense that the location of the eye of consciousness is restricted to the head. The unmediated experience of the body remains relatively unconscious. When the statement is made that I feel or I touch, for example, an abstraction is being expressed by self-construct. Bodily experience is first translated into languages and evaluated according to its compatibility with the self-construct. The self-construct then owns. And one, actually quite interesting, one etymological root of the word itself is possession, ownership, or disowns. For instance, represses, denies, or ignores these bodily experiences. Acknowledged experience of the body is possessed by head consciousness, and bodily experience incompatible with the self-construct is dispossessed. So what we do is we construct a self that owns experience, and only indirectly has this self access to bodily experience, only indirectly. It only has it as a self. So I own or disown bodily experience, I own the world or I disown the world. So it's like a construct that owns things, a thought experiment. And I think this is extraordinarily interesting, because only the thing that self means possession, being possessed of experience, that is being a self. And here we see a construct of something uniquely Western. And I've been trying to avoid those expressions, but this is what Iyengar would have called the Ahamkara taking over the position of the Atma, but doing it on a higher level. But this higher level is a construct, it's not a higher level in self. It's a dislocation of the self, making it less real, less perceived, less experienced, less self, actually. And I think this is hard enough, and I think it could be a good time here to round up with a little thing from the past. While it remains unknown how the psychology of individuals in ancient civilization should be described, it is argued below that, at least for some ancient individuals, psychological experience was a relatively unmediated awareness shaped by where it was experienced in the body by the imagination of an emphatic attunement with the source of stimulation. Stimulation from another provoked a sympathetic imagination of the embodiment and perspective of the other or object, rather than filtering the stimulus through an analysis of its meaning for the individual experience it. In other words, understanding through the body was a sympathetic intuition of the experience of other directly, and of others and objects, rather than an egocentric analysis of experience. In this sense, heart consciousness was not only integrative of the totality of subjective experience, but also integrative of the imagined empathetic experience of all living things. and objects perceived in the world. In religious terms, to experience heart consciousness was to experience what was referred to as the soul, anchored in the body, but evoking what was referred to as the spirit. An experience of mind or being that is inexplicably in modern language. The integrated psyche both creates and is created by something new. The psychospiritual organ centrally located in the heart and nowhere else. And this goes to show that this is completely different. It reminds me a bit, to round the whole thing up, about Newtonian thinking about time and space, because there you make a construct of space, you separate that, and then you put the objects in space, and thereby you have a location in space and you have the object. And in this case you have a subjectivity, the mind situated somewhere else, and situated in that knowingness are the experiences. They're sort of located in the mental space. You make a construct where you put in the experiences. And this is, of course, highly different from this direct experience of the world, because it takes an extra. You take a omväg, however you say that in English. You don't go directly to the experience. You construct first the self that's transcendent, and therefore this self is able as not being of the world, and not being of the world, you have the possibility of having objective experience, and then you can have shared experience with other people. But that experience is lacking in substance, is not as material, is not as fulfilling, it's sort of transparent, it's like shadows, and there you go. That's the mind-body split, put incredibly eloquent by Lind. I hope he's a Swede, I don't know. It's extremely interesting, and I think it's time that I relax a bit from this exhilaration of his tremendous writing, and I end here and I say thank you very much this afternoon. Bye bye.